August is here, and that means that the weather and the election cycle are heating up. The best way to beat the heat and stay up to date on the latest news from the US election to international breaking headlines is to become a DSR member and gain access to additional content across our network, in addition to other exclusive benefits. Use code BEATTHEHEAT to get 50% off of your membership and sign up today at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's Beat the Heat at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Now please enjoy the show.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. It's often said that Kamala Harris's entry into the presidential race has utterly transformed this campaign. But one aspect of that transformation that has gotten little attention is this question: does Harris have a real chance at changing the composition of the electorate by bringing more low-propensity Democratic voters into the process? Today we're chatting with Tom Bonnier, a well-regarded Democratic data analyst and senior advisor at the firm TargetSmart, who has produced a new analysis that finds striking surges in voter registration among traditionally Democratic voter groups. He's going to help us understand what the Harris bounce really amounts to and how durable it is. Great to have you on, Tom.
It's great to be here with you.
Okay, Tom, so you compared registration numbers for the week of July 21st of this year with the same week during the 2020 campaign. You found explosive changes among key demographics. 175% higher this time among Black women of 18 to 29, 150% among Hispanic women from 18 to 29, 85% higher among Blacks overall, 75% higher among young voters overall, 63% higher among Hispanics overall. Now, this was in 13 states. You did this, a combo of blue and red states. You did have Michigan and North Carolina in there. You think this applies across the board to all the swing states, right? Can you walk us through what you found?
Yeah, I'd love to. This type of analysis has been helpful to us to get a gauge, really the level that goes, at a much more fine level than polling, because this is actual individual actions. We've been hearing over the course of this campaign, primarily when President Biden was still at the top of the ticket, that Democrats had a problem with these low propensity voters, that they weren't engaged, that they weren't connected to the party, that they potentially would even be voting for Donald Trump. This initial analysis includes just 13 states because those are the states that have updated their voter registration file. What I was struck by is we went through state by state. You shared the overall results across the entire sample. It's universally pointing in the same direction. In each of the 13 states, you're seeing the exact same trend, where we're seeing a huge number of younger voters, voters of color, women. These are obviously concentric circles or overlapping groups who were not registering at very high rates before July 21st. And now, in this week, again, July 21st, as everyone remember, being the date that President Biden announced that he was stepping down, we look at the data from that week, and that's where we see this explosion across all 13 states, across these different groups.
So, Tom, who are these voters? Are they registering as Democrats or not? And what about white voters? How does that compare?
So they're overwhelmingly, now again, a caveat here, not every state has partisan registration. So we look at two things. We look at the states that have partisan registration, and we look at that. Specifically, are they registering as Democrats? And then in the states that don't have partisan registration, our team builds partisan models it's actually one of the easier things to model to predict the probability that someone would identify as a Democrat. And what we've found is that across this group, we're seeing about a 20-point advantage for Democrats, a combination of party registration and modeled partisanship among these new registrants. Compare that to the baseline from 4 years ago, where it was about a 5 or 6 point Democratic advantage for the same time period. I can't emphasize enough how rare it is to see swings in voter registration this substantial. Generally we will
Right.
get excited when you see movement along the lines of 3 or 4 points one way or another. To see this type of movement is really unusual. You asked about white voters. Certainly what we're seeing, the biggest increases in registration are among voters of color and younger voters. Among white women, you are seeing bigger increases. It's really tracking with the partisanship, right? I'm sure if we went down to a more micro level, and it's something I'd be happy to do, if we were isolating white Democratic men, I would anticipate we're seeing an increase there. It's generally around these Democratic constituencies, which again points to just elevated enthusiasm among the Democratic base for Vice President Harris.
It seems like we're getting some mixed messages right now. On the one hand, it seems clear that some of these non-white groups, especially young voters in them, are much more energized now with Harris at the top of the ticket. And we are seeing some polling that has Harris at 57, 58, 59% of Latinos, and in the 50s with young voters. Big change from Biden. But at the same time, she's still not where she needs to be with these groups, is she? How do we explain this tension? Does that worry you?
Well, I think it doesn't. Well, everything worries me at this point, given the stakes. I think
Right.
anyone who cares about this election should be worried.
Yeah.
But in terms of where we are and what we're seeing in the polling, no, yeah, I think we've seen substantial progress when you compare to where President Biden was with younger voters and voters of color. I have to say, I don't necessarily subscribe to the data that we were seeing at that point that was showing Donald Trump winning among these groups. Undoubtedly, there were deficiencies there for the president. And when you compare the polling, these are the voters that have come around to the vice president more than any other group. Not all of them are where they would need to be to replicate the winning coalition from 2020. Again, it's a very tough to poll group. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of do we trust the polling or not. But again, that's part of why we engage in this analysis. It's why in 2022, we were able to confidently say that we weren't going to see a red wave election because we were looking at these same sorts of registration trends that were contrary to what a red wave would look like. So again, I think this is an incredibly positive sign to see this surge in registration among exactly the groups that Vice President Harris needs to be coming around in order to form that winning coalition.
Another story of this election is that Harris is more or less hitting the targets she needs to with white voters. I think she needs to build that up a little more because $500 million in GOP ads are coming still. That's a welcome surprise. But let me ask as bluntly as possible, what levels of support does Harris have to hit with Latinos, with blacks, and with young voters to win this thing?
When we look at the baselines with those voters and acknowledging that there's been at least, and obviously there's some argument about the exact numbers, but it's undeniable that there has been some erosion in Democratic support. Generally we're talking about the highs from 2012 with the first black president running for re-election. So it's perhaps not the most valid comparison, though there is the potential for Vice President Harris to at least approach those numbers. But we have seen erosion in Democratic support. In terms of the algebra equation here, if Democratic support erodes much past 2020 levels with black voters and Latino voters, then we'll need to win a bigger share of the white vote. It's quite simple. As you say, the vice president is performing strongly with white voters. There's variation in the polling, especially among white seniors. Some show the vice president performing incredibly well. We saw the same dynamic with President Biden. Some showing the numbers not quite as positive, but certainly there's some potential there, I think, especially with white seniors, to be able to do better.
Tom, let me ask it differently. What level of support do you want Harris to hit with Latinos, blacks, and young voters to feel comfortable?
I'd like to see the vice president's campaign reach at a minimum the 2020 levels of support, the President Biden levels of support among black and Latino voters. I think that's possible. I think it's possible she could even potentially improve upon that support.
And young voters? Same?
Yeah, the same. The same. And, again, the other point I'd like to make, and again, I think this is obvious to most people, but it's lost in some of the public analysis, is especially as we see Latino voters. We haven't talked about Asian American voters either, but they were a key component of the 2020 demographic, even though they're only about 3% of the electorate. They're increasing. They are persuadable to some extent, but Vice President Harris has the potential to win Asian American voters by perhaps a 2-to-1 margin. When you look at these fast growing groups like AAPI voters and Latino voters, the vice president's campaign could win a slightly diminished share of those groups and still come out with a larger margin because they're a larger share of the electorate. But again, I think it's realistic for a campaign to at least match the margins from 2020.
So what are the prospects here for this to really put these Sunbelt states in play? Right now, Harris is up by less than a point in the polling averages in Arizona. Trump is up by even less in North Carolina and Georgia, which are clearly in play. Can you walk us through the demographics in those states and talk about why these registration numbers are important to what happens in them? How does Harris win in these places?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, what we saw prior to July 21st is it appeared that the Sunbelt states were falling off the table in terms of potential for a Democratic path to victory, leaving the narrow blue wall path. And really, that's about it. And pretty immediately, we saw the polling shift. When you talk about the path to victory in these states, number one, voters of color, especially Latino voters, Arizona and Nevada. I mentioned Asian American voters. I think people are very familiar with the Georgia path to victory because it got so much attention 4 years ago. But with a state with the potential for Black voters to account for 30% of the electorate, with Asian American voters as an emerging force there, again, they really put President Biden over the top. First-time voters in Georgia and Nevada are key. They're two of the youngest states demographically. Texas is in there as well, though again, even though people love talking about Texas this time of year, I don't know that we need to include that in this conversation. But when we talk about these new registration numbers, I think that's something that the Harris campaign has to like and see in this intensity of potential first-time voters. The other thing that's important to remember as we're talking about this registration analysis, for me, it's two things. It's one, it's just the simple math that you're adding more new voters to the electorate. And statistically, new registrants actually vote at a higher rate than voters who have been registered for a substantial amount of time.
They're
but,
engaged.
The raw numbers that we're talking about still in the end, might be, look, in this week, we were talking about in these states about 100,000 voters. So it's not nothing, but it's also not massive when you look at it state by state. The other element of this is that these registration trends have typically been indicative of an overall intensity gap or a surge in intensity among those groups writ large. So when we see more young Black women registering to vote, generally that's followed by more young Black women voting, even those who have already been registered to vote. So the Harris campaign has to look at this data and believe that there is a great potential here, not only to bring more first-time voters into the electorate in these Sunbelt states, which is the path of winning in Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, especially, but also to increase turnout among those lower propensity voters who are registered. Maybe they came out in that record-breaking turnout year of 2020, didn't come out in 2022. The Democratic Party has potentially struggled with them in the last 4 years, and they see the potential in this analysis to bring them back out to become part of a winning coalition this year.
Well, that's the big story of this election, really, is where are these lower propensity Democratic-leaning voters? How seriously do we take their seeming drift away from Democrats? And it seems like there's some cause for optimism here. Bottom line, what's your sense of the durability of the current state of the polling? What specifically does Harris have to do to win, and what worries you at night?
Well, when it comes to the polling, I think the thing we have to keep in mind, and you know this and have reported on this better than anyone, but we're look, in 2022, when the Senate polling missed by about 5 points, that was considered a banner year for polling. in terms of accuracy. And so we have to keep that in mind when we consider the polls now. I think people keep reminding us that, quote, a standard error one direction or the other could result in either candidate winning. I think the question for the pollsters, as it always has been, is how do they construct a likely voter model? How do they predict turnout? Who's going to turn out to vote? And it's easier when turnout is more predictable. The information we're seeing with these voter registration surges suggests a more volatile environment. There are a lot of questions to be answered when you go from 2020 as your baseline to 2024, where 2020 happened during a pandemic, widespread mail voting. We've seen states change voting systems dramatically, and we just have a very different dynamic. I feel for the pollsters and how difficult it is to construct a likely voter model. I wouldn't be surprised if we see even larger error in the polls when all is said and done. And I'm not going to go out on a limb and predict one way or another, but you do see more intensity and volatility in favor of Democrats right now. You know, what keeps me up, I think it's that larger volatility than ever. The instruments that we have to predict outcomes of election are not calibrated to a level of accuracy that should give anyone any comfort in predicting the outcome of this election.
Well, Tom, on that cheery note, we're going to call it a day. Thanks so much for coming on with us, man.
Thanks for having me on. I enjoy it.
You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.